Hi, I'm Joseph Noah. I'm a medical doctor and a biochemist, and I'm the author of Document X, Direct Evidence of God's Existence. Now we come to the miracle of Prophet Isa. He is commonly known as Jesus Christ, so I will use that term. The miracle of whether he was born without a father. Virgin birth, is not confined to Jesus Christ. You find that virgin birth can be traced to Egyptian and Greek mythology and Eastern tradition. Krishna, for example, was born of the Virgin Devaka. Mercury was born of the Virgin Maya. Buddha was born through the flank of his mother. At that time, it was customary, whenever there was a charismatic figure, they would ascribe certain and unique qualities to him, such as savior of mankind, immortality, performing miracles, and so on. Now, if we look at the Bible, you find that there's very little evidence to suggest that Jesus had a miraculous birth. In fact, it points to the contrary. Matthew, the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke agree on the 9-month gestational period of Mary. Mark is even silent on the virgin birth. Even the date of the birth is questionable. And then in the Bible, Jesus is often addressed as the son of a carpenter, as a normal person, not as a wonder man. He has brothers and sisters, and he has a father. Now, the Gospel writers, who recorded this miraculous birth, didn't realize the implication of that. They were ignorant of the laws of reproduction and didn't know that you need a Y chromosome to produce a male child. Now, back to the 21st century. It's a biological principle for mammals and human beings to procreate. You need both male and female agencies. And this is the law of procreation. Now, cloning doesn't violate this principle. It's just a manipulation of this principle. But we'll come back to the objections raised, that there are exceptions to the rule and so on. In the Quran, we know that the story of Jesus, the life story of Jesus, his birth, his upbringing and so on, and of his mother Mary, was enveloped in mystery and darkness for centuries. The Quran has dedicated several verses to the life story of Jesus Christ to enlighten us about the truth. Now, the Quran takes up the story in chapter 3, verse 36, where Mary's mother is pregnant with Mary. Now, Mary is born, she is named, and Mary's mother makes a vow that she dedicates Mary and Mary's offspring to the service of God. What is noteworthy here is Mary's mother mentioning Mary's offspring. She evidently entertained the idea that Mary would also have children like all other women. As Mary grows up under the care of Zechariah, who was a noble and righteous person, the idea was to prepare Mary mentally for her great future. Now, the next important event in Mary's life is now she has reached the age of discretion, and she now is informed through divine revelation through the Malaika in chapter 342 and 345. She's been chosen above all the other women at that time to bear a special son. Now, in 347, Mary expresses surprise, saying, "How could I have a son," speaking to God now, "when I've never been unchaste and no man has touched me?" So this was a perfectly intelligible question, because Mary knew that in order to produce offspring, you had to have a husband. Mary was aware of the reproductive rules. The prejudiced mind immediately jumps to a conclusion: this must be a miraculous child. He doesn't read on further. Now let us look at the answer given by God to Mary. "Even so, God creates what he wills, he but says unto it, be, and it is." Now these are the most misunderstood verses in this passage. Now let's examine these verses. We're going to look at them in 3 parts. The last part says, "He but says unto it, be, and it is." Now this is the phrase we all know, kun fayakun. Now this is not a magical phrase that God snaps his fingers and something appears from nothing. This is the ever-recurring phrase used throughout the Quran to convey God's ceaseless creative activity in the universe. If you look at, for example, the evolution of humankind, human species, it took hundreds of thousands of years. But they evolve in response to the command kun fayakun. And this is made clear in chapter 71, verse 14, where God says he evolved in different stages, forms and appearances, and in different environments. Then on an individual level, you find that you also pass through stages. God describes the embryonic stages of human development in chapter 23, 12, 13, and 14 and 15. Let's look at the second phrase where God says He creates what He wills. What His will doesn't mean His whims and fancies, but His laws of reproduction, which govern procreation. And this is expressed in a number of verses. In chapter 7, 189, it says that conception can only take place through the agency of a male. And then in chapter 76, it says He creates you from a sperm mingled. Mingled with what? This is made clear in 86. He creates you from a mixture of fluid which issues forth from between the pelvic arch and the external genitalia. The Quran describes the pelvic arch as an arch of bones, and the arch is completed by the backbone. The meaning of ribs does not fit in with the anatomy of the pelvis and must therefore be discarded. Now the pelvis houses the internal sexual organs, including the ovary, which produces the ovum. Therefore, the genitalia, which is referred to separately in this verse, must refer to the external genitalia. Now, since in classical Arabic, the pelvis is commonly associated with female anatomy, it is conceivable that the external genitalia refers to the male testes, which produce sperm. In chapter 42:11, it says, He creates for you pairs from amongst yourselves, and of cattle pairs too. And in this way does He multiply you. In other words, through the pair concept does He multiply you. There are people who object to this and say there are exceptions to the rule. For example, bees, they can develop without being fertilized. This is known as parthenogenesis. But the Quran speaks about human beings and cattle. It doesn't extend the argument to lower animals. So you cannot raise that objection. And then there's another objection that says, but Jesus was the exception. But this also is without foundation, because whenever Quran lays down a rule and there's an exception, it never fails to mention the exception. For example, when it says that it is forbidden to eat the flesh of pig, and then Allah mentions the exception, that this is allowed under certain exceptional conditions when there is a dire need for food. So again, that objection goes out by the window. Now let's look at the first part of the verse where Allah says, even so, which means it's a matter ordained. Now, even if an event seems inconceivable from a human perspective, God, with His having infinite power, can bring into existence a sequence of events which will have the desired result. And the desired result in this case is Mary having a child. And what is the most logical way, in accordance with the law of God, for Mary to have a child? Is to have a husband. And this is referred to in chapter 3. Now here the scene shifts, where God speaks to Muhammad now and says to him, we reveal to thee the unseen. God says to Muhammad, thou wast not with them when they debated with one another to decide which one of them should be charged with the care of Mary. Thou wast not with them when they contended with one another. So God informs Muhammad here of an event that had happened centuries ago, and that is the circumstances surrounding the birth of Jesus Christ. Now at that time, Mary was now eligible for marriage. This group of men the Quran speaks about must be those who vied with one another to marry Mary. Mary belonged to a priestly class and must have been a very attractive lady and was sought after. Now, the Quran speaks about which one of them should take charge of Mary. Now, that word charge in Arabic means yakfalu. And the meaning of that word is to look after somebody, to care for somebody. But more important, to conclude an agreement, to conclude a contract. And this is the definition of marriage in the Quran. So Mary's husband was chosen. She got married. And what happens in marriage? Sexual intimacy and conception. And this is referred to in chapter 19. And how does conception take place? It's made clear in 7:189 through the agency of a male. Now Mary is pregnant, and it says, and she conceived him, and she withdrew with him to a remote place. That him cannot refer to Jesus Christ. That first him is Jesus, but who is that mysterious second him? Because at that time, Jesus wasn't born. And this is made clear by the verse that follows, which says, and the pangs of labor the labor pains drove her towards the trunk of a palm tree. So in other words, at that stage, Jesus wasn't born. So that second hymn cannot be Jesus, because labor pains precede birth. And who was the ideal candidate for that hymn? Mary was on a journey, as stated by the phrase remote place. She was tired. She was near the end of her pregnancy. And pregnancy, delivering a child is a private affair. And Mary was a righteous, noble person. She was a shy person. And who was the best person to accompany her on a journey and to assist her with the birth but her husband? And then lastly it says, shake thee towards the palm tree. It will drop down fresh dates. So God informs her what to do. Now Mary obviously was exhausted and tired. And it's conceivable that she told the husband to shake the palm tree and so that the dates can drop off. What is the significance of this? It's to show us, more or less when Jesus' birth took place. When dates are fresh, they drop off. And also dates is an excellent source of nutrients and also reduces bleeding after giving birth to a child. Now, a few questions I want to ask. What is the purpose of a miraculous birth? If God wanted to demonstrate His power to induce belief, this wouldn't have been a wise way of doing it. For a miracle to be effective, it needs to be something spectacular that everybody can see. And none of these elements are present. If it was a miracle, it would have been a miracle for Mary only, and it would have created doubt instead of belief. If Mary conceived miraculously, another question is, who deposited the sperm in Mary's womb? How did the sperm arrive in Mary's womb? And another question is, we know that the fertilized egg, the sperm and the ovum each contributes about 50% towards the features of the offspring. Now, what kind of genetics did God put in that sperm? Did He decide that Jesus should have a nose or a chin like his father, which had no part in the marriage in any case? You see, we're piling absurdity upon absurdity. One sense of plausibility breaks down here. Now, we also know that in 1338 it says all prophets got married and bore children. Now, it's very possible that some descendants are still roaming on this planet of Jesus Christ. Now, what would you find if you sequence the DNA of those descendants? Would you find portions of divine DNA, portions of human DNA? The Quran gives us a clear and concise history about the events surrounding the birth of Jesus Christ. And there's every indication that it was a completely natural and normal birth. And then it concludes in 1934 with the verse that says, such is the truth of Jesus Christ, Son of Mary, about whose nature they so deeply disagree. Referring to the many conflicting opinions about Jesus' birth, he's speaking as a baby, his miracles, his ascension, his coming back, all which is rejected by the Quran. Now, some claim that Jesus was a false prophet, he was an impostor by certain people, and some claim that he was divine and semi-divine. Jesus was one of the great prophets of God who carried out his mission with conviction. He was born in accordance with the ordinary rules of nature. He grew up, he aged, he got married, had children, and later died a dignified death. Now, this is another misconception I want to clear up here, and that is the question of Malaika. If you look at the Arabic meaning of Malaika, it signifies a means of communication, a power, or a form of energy. So all forms of communication, whether it's human interaction, communicating via email, WhatsApp, is based on energy waves. Now, from a Quranic perspective, you can see it is a medium of expression whereby God interacts with his servants. The traditional meaning of Malaika as angels, as hypothetical beings, conveying messages from God to his servant, is not justified in the Quran. I'll tell you why. Chapter 3, where Mary is informed about the child that she was going to have, she addresses this question directly to God and asks him, how could this be when I was never unchanged and I'm untouched? She didn't say, oh, messenger, can you ask God? She spoke directly to God. Let me give you a practical example. Assuming that you are Mary and somebody brings you a message from your father, and this messenger tells you that you have won the lottery, you're going to direct your surprise at the messenger, not at your father. if you corresponded directly with your father via email or WhatsApp, your response would have been directed at your father. Is he true father? You might have asked something like that. Now, the same considerations apply in the conversation between Mary and God. That this conversation only makes sense if it's restricted to God and Mary and there's no intermediary involved. And the second reason why I say this, that this idea of Malaika as a medium of expression, is in chapter 16:49, where angels are described as belonging to the non-living. It's a non-living medium. And the third reason is that God says in 50 verse 16 that He's closer to us than our jugular veins. And this rejects the idea that some kind of invisible postman is necessary to carry a message from God somewhere out in heaven towards His servant. There's no distance between God and His servants. God is all-pervading. So this idea as invisible, hypothetical beings having wings, bringing information from God residing somewhere in the heavens towards His servant, again, is without foundation.